I have been sitting on this story for a very long time now. It happened back when I was just a teenager in high school. Today, I am in my early 30s. Just to give you some context on how much time has passed, I am going to keep my real name and the real names of my friends out of this, because we did some things that were not exactly legal, and even though a lot of time has gone by, I still do not want to take any chances of getting anyone into trouble. If you really wanted to, you could probably look up the place I am about to describe online. In my hometown, there used to be an abandoned military base. From what I was able to find out later on, it was primarily used during the Cold War and World War II. At one point, it was a fully functioning little town where over 200 military families lived. It had its own houses, streets, and even a church. It looked like a small, normal community, which made it feel even more bizarre when it was left completely empty. The village was abandoned in 1984, and it was just left to rot until 2014, when the city finally tore the whole place down. Growing up as a kid in that area, you could not escape the ghost stories about the abandoned village. We heard everything you could possibly imagine. People said demonic cults held rituals there in the middle of the night. Others claimed the government was performing top-secret military experiments deep underground. Anyone who lived in our town knew about the place. It was like a dark piece of local lore that everyone whispered about. When I was in middle school, my older brother came into my bedroom late one night, when I had some friends over for a sleepover. He looked completely pale and genuinely terrified, though looking back, he was probably just trying to scare us. He sat down and told us that he and his friends had actually gone to the abandoned village. We did not believe him at first, but he started describing what he saw in great detail. He told us about the village church and claimed there was a secret wooden trapdoor on the floor, right next to the altar. He said that when they stood near it, they could hear muffled moans and desperate screams coming from deep down in the basement. He laid it on so thick that by the end of the night, we were all completely terrified and believed every word. His story just added to the mystery of the base. For years, my friends and I would talk about this place. We made a pact that as soon as we were old enough to drive, we would go and find it ourselves. But all through high school, we just talked and never actually went. There were two main reasons for this. First, we did not know the exact location. We knew the general area near the airport, but that was a massive space with a lot of heavy forest and security fencing. Second, even though it was abandoned, it was still government property. We had no idea what kind of trouble we would get into if the military police caught us trespassing. But then, on a cool spring night during our senior year of high school, everything changed. My friend Alex came to us and said he had a contact who gave him the exact coordinates of the entrance to the village. We laughed and told him he was making it up. I was so sure he was lying that I challenged him. I said we should go right then and there to prove he was wrong. I fully expected us to drive around in circles and go home. And so, around 11 o'clock that night, 4 of us piled into my car and made the 15-minute drive toward the airport. Alex sat in the passenger seat looking nervous. He was clearly not as confident as he had claimed. Every few yards he would tell me to pull over, pointing into the pitch-black woods and saying he thought this was it. Each time it turned out to be a dead end or just thick brush. But then, we saw an extremely overgrown dirt road cutting into the trees. Alex pointed at it and insisted this had to be the path. Right at the entrance, partially hidden by low-hanging branches, was a battered, rusted no trespassing sign. I started to get really nervous. It was my car, and I did not want to lose my license or get arrested. But Alex and my other friend, Nick, were completely determined to keep going. They did not care about getting in trouble. They kept repeating that we had been talking about this our entire lives, and we could not back down now. Eventually, they wore me down. I put the car in gear and slowly turned onto the dirt path. To avoid attracting attention, I turned off my headlights completely, relying only on the dim moonlight filtering through the trees. I let the car roll forward at a crawl. After a short distance, we came across a black and white striped roadblock gate blocking the path. There was no security guard in the little booth next to it, so I had to get out of the car, walk into the cold air, and manually lift the heavy metal arm. As we kept driving, things started to get incredibly strange. Littered along both sides of the dirt road was an unbelievable amount of old furniture. There were wooden bed frames, dressers with the drawers pulled out, broken tables, and chairs half swallowed by the weeds. It looked like people had dumped their entire lives on the side of the road, or like a mass evacuation had occurred in a hurry. A few minutes later, we hit a second roadblock gate. This time, I made Alex get out and lift it. Once we passed that final checkpoint, we officially entered the village. It was a completely surreal feeling. After a decade of hearing ghost stories, we were finally standing inside the legend. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. It was a complete neighborhood with neat rows of houses, but everything was decaying. Vine covered the walls, roofs had collapsed, and the asphalt was cracked with thick weeds pushing through. I slowly drove the car up to the front of the dark church and parked. We got out of the car and shut the doors as quietly as possible. The silence of the place was heavy and suffocating. The first thing I did was look around for any security cameras. I did not see any, which made me feel a little better. We decided to check out the church first. Inside, the walls were covered in layers of spray paint and graffiti. I walked straight up to the altar to look for the trapdoor my brother had told me about years ago. Unsurprisingly, there was nothing there. It was just solid concrete. My brother had definitely made that part up. After leaving the church, we decided to walk down the street and look inside some of the abandoned houses. It was deeply unsettling. These were real homes where families once lived, now completely frozen in time. Some of them looked like they had been hit by a massive storm, with walls knocked down and debris everywhere. Others were completely intact, which actually felt much creepier. Our friend Scott was with us, and the entire time he was absolutely panicking. He kept looking over his shoulder, whispering that he felt like we were being watched and that someone else was there with us. Scott was always the easily frightened one in our group. We kept telling him to calm down, explaining that his mind was just playing tricks on him because of the dark and the creepy atmosphere. But then, while we were standing inside one of the intact living rooms, we all froze. We heard a very distinct, heavy creaking sound coming from the upper floor. It was not the natural settling sound of an old house. It sounded exactly like the slow, deliberate footsteps of someone walking across wooden floorboards right above our heads. I whispered to the group, asking if they heard that. Everyone nodded in absolute silence. Instead of staying quiet, Alex suddenly shouted into the darkness, asking if anyone was up there. Instantly, the creaking sound stopped. We stood frozen in that house for what felt like an eternity, debating what to do. Alex and Nick tried to rationalize it, saying it was just the wind or the old wood shifting, but Scott was convinced we were not alone. Honestly, I had a horrible feeling in my gut, and I told them I wanted to leave immediately. Since I was the one with the keys to the car, they did not have much of a choice. As we walked toward the front door to leave, Scott suddenly jumped back and let out a sharp gasp. He pointed out of a side window. In the dim moonlight, we could clearly see 3 distinct shadows of human heads, moving along the side of the neighboring house. They were walking quietly, heading straight toward the backyard of the very house we were standing in. My heart hammered against my ribs. Those were definitely people, and they were trying to surround us. I whispered as quietly as I could that we needed to run for the car on the count of 3. Everyone nodded. We burst out of the front door and sprinted as fast as we could toward my parked car. But as we got closer, Scott, who was running in the lead, let out a blood-curdling scream. Standing right next to the driver's side of my car was a very tall woman. She was wearing an incredibly dirty, tattered black dress that looked decades old. The rear door of my car was wide open, and she had one leg already inside the back seat, as if she was about to climb in and hide. When Scott screamed, the woman, startled, pulled her leg out of the car and sprinted away from us, disappearing into the dark entrance of the church. We did not stop. We scrambled into the car, slamming and locking the doors. I turned the key, threw the car into reverse, and slammed on the gas. I drove so fast down that winding dirt road that I lost traction on the gravel and almost flipped the car into a ditch, but I managed to keep us on the path until we hit the main highway. That night, we stayed up for hours trying to make sense of what we had seen. The most logical explanation was that they were squatters or homeless people using the abandoned military base for shelter. That made perfect sense, except for one highly disturbing detail. Why was that woman trying to climb into the back seat of my car? What would have happened if we had walked back to the car a few seconds later, got in, and driven away without noticing her hiding in the dark behind us? It was also terrifying to realize that we had walked around that base for nearly an hour, believing we were completely alone, while those people were silently watching us from the shadows the entire time. Years later, I told this story to my girlfriend, who is now my wife. She suggested we look up the base online. That was when I discovered the town had torn it down in 2014. I am just incredibly grateful that Scott saw that woman and screamed when he did. If we had been even 10 seconds slower, our night could have ended in a tragedy that I do not even want to think about. But that was not the only time I had a bizarre and unexplained encounter in an abandoned building. When my wife and I first started dating in our early 20s, we were pretty reckless. We did a lot of things that I would never do now, mostly involving exploring abandoned properties. I never believed in ghosts or the paranormal, but she was obsessed with it. I only went along with it because I was crazy about her and wanted to keep her safe. Out of all the decaying structures we explored, there was only one night that left me completely speechless and unable to find a rational explanation for what I saw. It was an incredibly dark, overcast night. The clouds were thick, blocking out any light from the moon or the stars, making the rural roads feel like a black void. She had found an old, isolated farmhouse that was miles away from any other neighbors. The house was in terrible shape, leaning slightly to one side, and looking like a strong gust of wind could knock it down. I was always highly anxious about entering these places, not because of spirits, but because I was terrified of the structural integrity. I did not want the roof collapsing on our heads. I had to use my shoulder to break through the boarded-up front door. Inside, we found ourselves in what must have been the living room, but half of the floor was completely gone. In the center of the room was a massive dark hole where the floorboards had rotted and collapsed into the basement below. I shone my flashlight down into the hole, seeing rusty pipes and shattered concrete. I told her right then that we needed to leave because the house was a death trap. But she just gave me her usual response, telling me to just wait a minute. She started carefully stepping around the edges of the hole to explore the rest of the ground floor. I refused to budge, keeping my back pressed against the front door frame where I knew the support beams were strongest. She laughed at me and called me a coward, her flashlight beam bouncing around the dark walls. After a few minutes of standing there, my curiosity finally got the better of me. I carefully navigated around the gaping hole in the floor to join her in the adjacent room. It was a complete disaster. There was old garbage, broken furniture, and rotting clothes piled almost to the ceiling. She was happily digging through the piles, looking for old letters or personal items left behind by the former residents. She turned to me and suggested I go check out the second floor. She must have seen the hesitation on my face, because before I could object, she said that the sooner we finished searching the house, the sooner we could go home. Reluctantly, I turned and walked toward the stairs. Every step I took on those wooden stairs made a loud protestation creak, and I was convinced I was about to plunge through the wood. At the top of the stairs, there was a bedroom immediately to my right. I walked in, swinging my flashlight around. It was a very sad sight. There was an old metal bed frame with a mattress that was still neatly made, and a faded, folded bathrobe lying at the foot of the bed. It felt like the person who lived here had just stepped out for a moment and never returned. There was junk everywhere, decaying clothes, broken vanity mirrors, and dust so thick it made me cough. In the far corner of the room, I noticed a low wooden door leading to a crawl space. Sometimes people hid interesting things in these tight spaces, so I knelt down and crawled inside. It was filled with boxes of old baby food and unopened packages of diapers. The items looked like they were from the 1950s or 60s. Rodents had chewed through many of the boxes, and the smell of rot and decay was absolutely overpowering. Just as I was about to back out of the crawl space, I heard a faint rhythmic creaking sound. I shone my light around and noticed a small, narrow opening in the wooden wall at the far end of the crawl space. It was a tight, horizontal shaft that seemed to run across the entire length of the house, connecting to the bedroom on the other side of the hallway. The creaking sound was definitely coming from that opening. I was far too large to squeeze through that narrow shaft, so I backed out of the crawl space, stood up, and walked out of the bedroom. I headed down the dark hallway toward the second bedroom at the far left. As I got closer, the rhythmic creaking sound grew much louder. My heart started beating rapidly, though I told myself it was probably just a family of raccoons nesting in the walls. I reached the doorway and stepped inside, and what I saw made me freeze instantly. Sitting in an old wooden rocking chair in the center of the room, facing the dark window, was a woman. I stood there, completely paralyzed. The high back of the chair blocked most of her body, but I could see the top of her head, which had thin graying hair, and the bottom of a long dark skirt draped over her legs. She was rocking back and forth in a slow, steady rhythm. The wood of the chair groaned with every movement. I tried to see her reflection in the glass of the window, but the night outside was too dark, and my flashlight beam was reflecting off the dust in the air. I took a small step forward, and the floorboard beneath my shoe let out a loud squeak. The moment she heard that noise, the rocking chair stopped dead still. I panicked and started apologizing, stammering that we did not know anyone was living here, and that we would leave right away. But before I could finish my sentence, the chair began to rock again, as if she had completely dismissed my presence. For some reason, instead of running away, I took another step forward and asked if she was okay or if she needed help. Again, the chair stopped rocking. Slowly, the woman stood up from the seat. She stood with her back to me for a moment, and then she let out a low, vibrating hum. It sounded like a mother humming a lullaby to a child, but the tone was incredibly hollow and cold. Suddenly, she whipped her body around to face me. I did not see any details of her face because my survival instincts kicked in instantly. All I saw was pale, deeply wrinkled skin and a pair of dark, hollow eyes before I turned and bolted out of the room. I flew down the stairs, screaming at my girlfriend that we had to leave right now. I grabbed her arm and told her there was someone living upstairs, but she just laughed at me, completely convinced that I was trying to play a prank on her to get back at her for calling me a coward. I was begging and pleading with her, my voice shaking, but she refused to believe me. She insisted on going upstairs to see for herself. I could not let her go up there alone, so I followed her back up the stairs, my eyes darting around the shadows. I watched her walk down the hallway and step into the doorway of the second bedroom. When she reached the threshold, she suddenly stopped and whispered, "Oh my God." I rushed to her side, ready to grab her and run, but then she burst out laughing. I looked into the room. The rocking chair was there, but it was completely empty. There was no old woman. She turned to me, laughing hysterically, and asked if I was seriously terrified of an empty chair. I swore to her on my life that a woman had been standing right there just a minute ago, but she just shook her head and walked back out into the hallway, saying we could finally leave since I was so freaked out. We walked back toward the top of the stairs, but before we could take a single step down, we both froze. From the bedroom behind us, the rhythmic creaking sound of the rocking chair started up again. My girlfriend turned to me, her face completely draining of color. She whispered, "What is that?" As we stood frozen at the top of the stairs, we heard the distinct, low humming sound of the lullaby drifting out of the bedroom. My girlfriend took a few hesitant steps back toward the door and peered inside. Through the doorway, she saw the rocking chair moving back and forth on its own, with the silhouette of the old woman sitting in it, humming to herself. She did not say a word. She just turned around, grabbed my hand, and we sprinted down the stairs, threw open the front door, and ran as fast as we could to my car. Once we were safely inside the car and speeding down the dark road, she started crying and screaming, asking what we had just seen. I did not have an answer for her. I wanted to look back at the second-floor window as we drove away to see if anyone was watching us, but I was too terrified to look. I still do not know what we encountered that night. Part of me wants to believe it was just a homeless woman who had somehow survived in that rotting house. But the front door was boarded up. There was a massive hole in the living room floor, and she had vanished and reappeared in a matter of seconds. Not long ago, my wife and I drove back to that area out of curiosity, but the house was completely gone. The city had demolished it, leaving nothing but an empty, overgrown field. And then, there is the third story, which is perhaps the one that haunts me the most, because it happened right next door to my own home. When I was in middle school, my family moved into a beautiful, spacious house in a great neighborhood. It was the perfect place for a teenager. There were plenty of kids my age, and we spent our summers playing outside. But there was one major problem with our new home, and that was our neighbor. He was the definition of a bitter, angry old man. He lived alone in a dark, poorly maintained house right next to ours. Whenever my friends and I went outside to play football, he would watch us. If our ball even rolled near the edge of his grass, he would violently bang his fists against his front window and scream at us from inside to get off his property. We were good kids and we always respected his boundaries, but it did not matter. He seemed to hate our very existence. He would sit by his window for hours, just waiting for us to step outside so he could yell at us. This went on for about 6 months after we moved in. But then one day, the banging stopped. We did not see him at his window anymore. Weeks went by, and his yard became overgrown, but we just assumed he was finally ignoring us. I even joked with my friends that the old man must have finally passed away. About a month later, my friend Joel was staying over at my house. We woke up in the early hours of the morning, while it was still pitch black outside, to the sound of sirens and flashing lights reflecting on my bedroom walls. We looked out my window, which faced directly toward the old man's house. Right at that moment, we saw 2 paramedics wheeling a gurney out of his front door. On the gurney was a black, zipped-up body bag. I felt an immediate, sickening wave of guilt wash over me. I had been joking about him being dead, and it turned out he actually was. He had passed away inside that house, completely alone, and nobody had realized it for over a month. After his body was removed, the house sat completely abandoned. All of his furniture, clothes, and personal belongings remained exactly where he had left them. He had a son who lived in another state, but the son never came to clean out the house or put it up for sale. It just sat there, rotting in the middle of our neighborhood. For the next few years, I would look out my bedroom window at night and stare into the dark, empty rooms of his house. It was incredibly creepy knowing that a man had decomposed in there for weeks. I used to tease my friend Joel, telling him that I could see the old man's ghost wandering through the dark hallway. Joel was easily spooked, and he would cover his ears and scream at me to stop. One night, during our junior year of high school, Joel finally got tired of my teasing. He looked at me and dared me to actually go inside the old man's house. I did not want to do it, but Joel started calling me a coward in front of our other friends. I figured the house had been empty for years, and nobody would care if I took a quick look inside. I walked over to the side of his house. I tried the front door, but it was locked tight. I tried to kick it, but I was a skinny teenager, and the door did not budge. But then, I noticed a small window next to the porch. I gave it a push, and to my surprise, the lock was broken, and it slid open easily. I climbed through the window and stepped into the darkness. The very first thing that hit me was the smell. It was a thick, sweet, and suffocating odor of rot and decay. It was so intense that I immediately started gagging. I had to pull the collar of my shirt over my nose just to breathe. Using my flashlight, I looked around. The living room was exactly as he had left it. On the side table next to his dusty recliner was an open book with a bookmark placed in the middle of the pages. I walked into the kitchen, where the horrific smell was even worse. I realized this must have been where his body was found. On the kitchen table, there was a coffee mug and a sweater draped over the back of a chair. Dusty pots and pans were still sitting on the stove burners. It felt like a museum of a life that had suddenly stopped. I walked down a narrow hallway and entered the bedroom, which had a large window that faced directly toward my own bedroom. I looked out and saw my friends standing in my bedroom window, watching me. I waved my flashlight at them and they waved back, their faces pressed against the glass. But as I was waving, a massive, incredibly loud bang echoed from the other side of the house. It did not sound like the house settling. It sounded like a heavy object, or a person, throwing themselves violently against a wall. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I stood perfectly still, listening for any follow-up sounds, but the house went dead silent again. I looked back at my friends in the window, and they looked confused, wondering why I had suddenly stopped. I was completely done. The smell and the noise had pushed me over the limit. I ran back to the front door, unlocked it from the inside, and ran back to my house. I told my friends about the smell and the loud bang, and we talked about it for a bit. But we eventually calmed down and went to sleep. But later that night, Joel shook me awake. I groaned and asked what he wanted. He whispered that he could not sleep because he kept hearing a strange noise coming from the old man's house. I told him he was just letting his imagination get the best of him, but then, in the silence of my room, I heard it too. It was a slow, heavy double knock sound. Knock, knock. I sat up in bed and stared out the window toward the neighboring house. Joel pointed at the old man's bedroom window, his hand trembling. He whispered that there was someone standing in the room. I looked, and in the dim light of the street lamp, I could see a dark silhouette of a person standing in the doorway of the bedroom I had been in earlier. I tried to tell Joel it was just a coat rack or a shadow, but then the silhouette slowly took 3 steps forward and stood directly in front of the window, staring straight back at us. It was clearly the shape of a person. We all began to panic, waking up our other friends. We watched in absolute terror as the figure stood there for a few minutes, before slowly stepping backward, fading back into the deep blackness of the room. We did not sleep for the rest of that night, keeping a constant watch on the window, but we never saw the figure again. A year later, the old man's son finally arrived with a massive dumpster. He spent weeks gutting the entire house, throwing away all of his father's belongings, and sold the property shortly after. My dad talked to him and found out that he had a terrible relationship with his father, which was why he had avoided coming back for so long. To this day, that silhouette in the window is the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed. I am just glad I had my friends there to witness it with me, so I know my mind was not just playing tricks on me in the dark. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.